Okay. I think we'll wait one more minute to give the few remaining folks who haven't signed in a chance to do so.
Hey, Mr. Carr, I sent you an email. I think do you have a class after this one?
I do, until 12:15.
Okay. I just want to let you know that I sent you an email.
Okay, okay, I'll check my email and I'll get back to you.
All right, thank you.
Yeah. So I think we have most of everybody here at this point. Today, I do have a couple of announcements for you guys before we jump into our chapter on social psychology. I have most of your second essays graded at this point. I do have a handful of you folks who have not yet been graded. I think if your name starts with H or later, I still have to grade your essay. So that's, I think, about 10 or 12 of you guys that I have left to grade on the second essays. I have been working on that, and unfortunately, I haven't been able to devote all my time to that because I've had some other things that I've been having to work on as well. But I have been working on it, and if you're one of the folks who is not yet graded, you will see a grade show up. My goal is by the end of the day, and then I have another section to grade, and I'm trying to get them done by the end of the day as well, but I am working on it, I promise. I also wanted to announce that we have an extra credit opportunity that I've posted, and I'm also going to do another one that involves watching a movie like I think I talked about before. So there are going to be 2 extra credit opportunities that are going to be posted here soon. I'm going to talk about one of them here in a second. And do I have someone trying to get in here? Yes. Okay. So shalom, Donald. Mazel tov. All right. So Amy Rogers, love your music. It's great. Oh, thank you. Yeah, the music that I shared with you guys. Yeah, I really appreciate that. And I've been hoping to maybe do some more songwriting now that I've been home more, but there's just a lot of work-related stuff to do, and I don't want to make you guys have to wait any longer than is necessary on the essays. I will do more songwriting, and eventually I will get to that. So I wanted to talk a little bit about an extra credit opportunity that I have posted for you guys. So I'm gonna try to get my other screen shared here for you guys. Let's see. Okay. So you should see here the Canvas page for the course. Someone please let me know if that's not the case. Down here towards the bottom, you see an extra credit module section. There was one for the practice Zoom meetings that I did about a week and a half ago when we were getting ready to do this. And it's too late for that because I'm not doing any more practice Zoom meetings, but I do have another one posted for you guys, which is an extra credit discussion on the topic of gender, which is a topic that we went over last week. So there is a relatively well-known and controversial Canadian psychologist by the name of Jordan Peterson. I may have mentioned him before, but he's been controversial for a couple of years now because he has some views on gender that have upset some folks. And he's gotten into some hot water regarding the use of gender pronouns and that sort of stuff that we were talking about. And he has sort of conservative views on this topic. And some might argue that he is a gender essentialist. I'll let you decide. But in this extra credit discussion forum, I have shared a link to an infamous interview that he did with a British journalist who I believe is a feminist, and they got into this massive argument about the gender pay gap. and as it describes here in the description. So what I'd like for you guys to do, and it's worth 5 points of extra credit, it would be like getting 5 points back on an exam, is to watch that YouTube video. It's about half an hour long, and it's controversial. There's, it's a pretty heated argument, and he espouses some views that some folks may strongly disagree with, other folks may agree with. But I'm really curious what your take on it is, on the topics discussed in the interview. It's Donald says, "Oh, that's the one where that chick gets really salty." Yeah, they both get kind of salty with each other, but she gets particularly salty with him, and she takes issue with a lot of the things that he says. And some have made the argument that she puts words in his mouth in this interview, but I'll let you guys decide. Again, Jordan Peterson is a controversial Canadian psychologist. He's probably most well known for his best-selling book, 12 Rules for Life. I've read it, and I kind of enjoyed it, to be honest, but I don't know if I necessarily agree with all of his views on gender. But these are topics that I have an internal debate with myself about as well sometimes. But I am open-minded about these topics, and I'm curious what you guys make of this YouTube video with Jordan Peterson and Kathy Newman. And Donald's already seen it because he's seen a segment of it because I played a clip from it in my sociology class that he took with me last semester. So he has a little bit of an idea of what I'm talking about already. But check it out and write a 150-word post, just addressing some of the issues that I talk about here in the heading of the discussion. And I would like to also see you respond to a couple of your classmates. Stay respectful of one another. I know that folks are going to have different opinions on this video, and some of this stuff is kind of controversial, but I'm really curious what you guys make of it because it's such a hot topic. So that's worth 5 points of extra credit. And I also want to reiterate that by sharing the YouTube video, I'm not necessarily endorsing all of Jordan Peterson's views or Kathy Newman's views. I'm just trying to encourage healthy discussion on the topic. So that's worth 5 points of extra credit. I also wanted to mention that quiz 4 is due coming up here on the 14th, which is a week away. It covers chapters 12 and 13, and we're going to be getting into chapter 12 today on social psychology. We're going to spend a couple of days on that chapter, and then chapter 13 on personality. And I think most of you guys at this point have completed the third exam, which is up, has been up since last week. It was due on April 5th. If you haven't done it yet, please go ahead and do it. I've left it open for folks who have been stragglers on that. I think there are a couple of folks left who still need to take that exam, but please go ahead and get it done. I try to work with people, especially given the current situation. It's crazy, but please don't abuse my kindness and wait forever to take the exam. I will eventually close it. So, go ahead and get that done. And also the third essay is going to be due on April 23rd. And for that particular essay, the way that I have the topic laid out here on Canvas is that you pick a mental illness and write a paper about it. So that's the suggested topic. Pick a mental illness, read chapters 14 and 15, and Devin, I'm looking at a question I've received. I thought you said it was due at a different time. Oh, the exam, if you're talking about the exam, there's not a late penalty if you haven't done the exam yet. You can still do it without a late penalty. I still have it open. Yeah, so that's
disregard my email then.
Oh, Caleb?
Yes.
Yeah, so we have a couple of folks that are worried about the exam. Yeah, it's still open, and if you haven't done it yet, that's okay. You can still do it. I set a due date, I think of Sunday night on that, but I don't know, maybe that was a little too soon. I don't know. So if you haven't done it yet, that's totally okay. You can still do it. And yeah, no stress. And I think that applies to a few people. So just get it done, and it's 60 minutes, open book. I also have a study guide for that posted as well. So for the third essay assignment, we have the suggested topic of picking a mental illness that you're interested in and writing a paper describing the mental illness and its treatment. So you would look at chapters 14 and 15 for that. And if that's a topic that doesn't particularly interest you, if you want to pick your own topic for the third essay, you can do that as well. So if let's say you want to write a paper about false memories, for example, if that's a topic that interests you, that'd be fine. If you have an alternative topic for the third essay, just run it by me, email me your idea for the topic, and I'll probably approve it, right? So this is just a suggested topic. You can pick your topic if you'd like, just run it by me. Jasmine has asked, is there a due date for the extra credit assignment? Just get it done before the end of the course. Yeah, so I haven't set a hard due date on that, but the course does end, I think, on April 29th, or one of the early days in May is the end of the course, if I remember correctly. Let me pull that up here. Just get it done before the end of the course, and that'll apply to the other extra credit assignment that I'm going to post as well, which involves watching a film and writing a response to the film from a psychological perspective. That'll be due just by the end of the course as well. So our last day is May 5th. That's going to be the day that the final exam is due. So any extra credit stuff will be due by May 5th. Yeah. What will finals look like campus-wide? Caleb has asked. So for me, I'm just putting the final on Canvas, and it's going to be basically the same sort of format that you saw for exam 3. And you haven't taken it yet, Caleb, but you will, and you'll see what I'm talking about. But I'm anticipating that the final will be 45 to 50 multiple choice questions. It'll come from chapters 12 to 15, and there will be a 1-hour time limit, and it will be open book, right? So I'm making it open book, but the trade-off is that I'm putting a 1-hour time limit on it so that you can't spend too much time looking up your answers. If you look up every single answer, then you'll run out of time on the exam. So that's the trade-off. So I've reduced the time limit a little bit, but I've made it open book, and I'll have a study guide for it. So I can't speak as to what other instructors are going to do. I know some other instructors are doing cumulative finals. I'm not. Some other instructors are requiring Respondus Lockdown Browser and Respondus Monitor webcam proctoring for the exams. I thought about doing that, but I decided not to, simply because so many of you guys are taking your exams on tablets and phones. Respondus Lockdown Browser and Monitor doesn't work on tablets and phones, and it would just really, yeah, exactly. So Amy has asked, what if you don't have a webcam? And that's my point. Yeah, so that's why I haven't decided to use that program, because a lot of folks don't have a webcam. A lot of folks don't have a computer even. They're using their tablets and phones to do this. So because Respondus doesn't work on tablets and phones, I've decided not to require it. And what I've done instead is instead of doing that, I've just put a pretty strict time limit on the exams to make up for that. So that's what I've done, but some instructors may require Respondus Lockdown Browser, which requires a computer, or they may require Respondus Monitor, which requires a webcam. And I can't speak for other instructors as to what they're going to do about students who don't have a computer or a webcam. I wish I could, but I really can't speak to how they're going to handle that situation. So you'll just have to take that up with your other instructors when it comes to that issue. That's all I have for you guys in terms of announcements today. Without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into chapter 12, which is our chapter on social psychology. Get those slides pulled up for you guys. Okay, so you guys should see a full screen view of chapter 12 slides. If that is not the case, please let me know. So chapter 12 deals with the topic of social psychology. And like Amy just said, her favorite chapter, it's one of my favorite chapters as well, because it's just so interesting to look at the way that other people affect our behavior. Social psychology is usually traced back to the post-World War II period. The end of World War II caused a lot of folks to start asking themselves the question, how did we get to this point? Meaning, how did humanity get to the point where the entire planet just about was involved in a war? How did we get to the point where the government of the nation of Germany was systematically exterminating Jews, gypsies, homosexuals, etc., the Holocaust? How did we get to the point where atomic bombs were being dropped on Japan? How did we get to the point where human beings behaved in such an inhumane way towards each other? World War II was really a traumatic event for humanity. And the way that human beings behaved during that period really was kind of a wake-up call, in the sense that there was a loss of innocence that kind of was associated with that period. And particularly when it came to the Holocaust, a lot of folks were just really baffled as to how the German people went along with someone like Adolf Hitler. How was it that the German people sat by idly and allowed the Holocaust to happen, for example? What it could explain this human behavior on a mass scale? This was a question that really began to consume a lot of psychologists, and the field of social psychology was kind of born out of that period, particularly with the work of the psychologist Kurt Lewin, who was a psychologist of Jewish descent who immigrated to the United States during World War II to escape the Nazis. And as someone of Jewish descent, he was particularly troubled, to put it mildly, by the events of World War II and of the Holocaust. And Kurt Lewin and folks like him began asking these questions. How the hell can human beings behave in such an inhumane way towards each other? So really, that was the question that really spurred the birth of social psychology as a discipline. And Kurt Lewin was generally considered to be the father of social psychology. So that's just a little bit of a historical background on the field of social psychology. So social psychologists are ultimately interested in the question of attribution. The attributions are our ways of explaining other people's behaviors, right? So, for example, if you're driving down the road and some driver accidentally cuts you off, or maybe on purpose, who knows whether it was on purpose or accidentally, but some driver cuts you off, and you honk your horn and you show them your middle finger. And when you're thinking about this other driver, you're probably thinking to yourself, what a terrible driver, right? Screw them. They can go straight to hell. And other interesting choice words that you may yell out your window or vocalize out loud with your passenger in the car, expressing your frustration with this terrible driver, right? So what you've just done in that situation, putting it mildly, yeah. So so in that particular situation, you've made a personal attribution of that other driver's behavior. And I've done this many times. This is just one, you know, this happens in a lot of situations, not just on the road, but you've attributed their terrible driving to some personal characteristic of them, probably that they're a terrible driver, right? That's a personal attribution. Uh, on the other hand, if you were to be a little bit more, shall we say, compassionate, might be a word we could use towards the other driver. Let's say, on the other hand, you let them off the hook. You say, well, you know, maybe they were in a hurry because they had a child that was having a medical emergency, or maybe they were running late for work, or maybe they were really stressed out and not paying attention properly to what's going on, right? You know, maybe there was some situation that that person was in that caused them to drive in that way. In that case, you would be making a situational attribution. Now, the fact of the matter is, and this is something that social psychologists have identified early on, is that most of us have a tendency to attribute other people's behavior, particularly their bad behavior, to some sort of personal trait. In other words, we have a tendency to make personal attributions when we're explaining other people's behavior, particularly their bad behavior. And this relates back to the events of World War II, because folks like Kurt Lewin were asking the question, you know, what was up with the Germans? How did they go along with somebody like Hitler? You know, so one common idea that you would hear about at that time was that people would say that Germans were just cold-hearted, evil people, right? Well, Kurt Lewin, even though he was Jewish and he was very upset about the events of the Holocaust, Kurt Lewin and other social psychologists began to suspect that maybe it wasn't that the German people were particularly evil or bad any more than the rest of us. Maybe there was just something about the situation that the German people were in that made them vulnerable to a charismatic, evil leader like Hitler. I think we could probably all say that there's probably something evil about Hitler, but were the German people evil people, right? The social psychologists would say, before we conclude that the German people were just all evil, cold-hearted people, maybe there was something about the situation in Germany that made the Germans particularly vulnerable to a nationalistic, charismatic leader like Hitler. Is anybody familiar with the history in Germany around World War II? Were there any things going on in Germany that might have made Germany vulnerable to a charismatic nationalistic leader like Hitler? Anybody? Anybody familiar with that? Yeah, Aubrey.
They had just gone through World War I, and they had been put under a lot of regulations and things by the other nations after they'd been faulted with World War I. They've been put under a lot of restrictions and strains, and having to, you know, pay retributions to other nations that were causing them to have a really messed up economy, to the point where there's pictures of kids like in Germany, just like middle class children, like playing on the floor with stacks and stacks of millions and millions of dollars, because their currency was just so devalued and debased that it didn't even, like, it was nothing. It was like playing with a couple of quarters, like it didn't even matter. And so having a strong leader that was going to say, no, we're not going to take this, was really unifying. Before, I mean, when they didn't really have, you know, they were able to overlook a lot of stuff because they were seeing this person that was going to take them out of the awful situation they were in.
Yeah, Aubrey's absolutely correct about that. And I'm no historian, but I do know for a fact that the treaty that ended World War I, as Aubrey mentioned, blamed Germany for the events of World War I, which was an oversimplification. There were a lot of parties involved that aggravated the situation, that instigated World War I. And Germany did play a role. They did have some responsibility, but all the blame was placed on Germany, which was humiliating. And the treaty caused them to not be allowed to have their own military anymore. So they weren't even allowed to have an army or a military of any kind. There were these economic sanctions that were placed on Germany that basically caused them to have their own Great Depression. There were food lines everywhere. The currency was indeed basically worthless. You might as well have made paper airplanes out of the bills of the currency. You probably would have had more value as a paper airplane than it would as money, right? Poverty was everywhere. And then along comes Adolf Hitler, who is this, really, he's really into having this pride about being a German, right? Which is kind of interesting because Hitler himself was actually from Austria originally. Caleb mentions if you read the book Mein Kampf, it goes a lot more into, which was Hitler's autobiography, which is German for My Struggle. If you read Mein Kampf, you get a sense of where Hitler's thinking was. But along comes this really charismatic leader, Adolf Hitler. He was a gifted public speaker, and he provided Germany with this sense of pride again, and he gave them this common enemy that they could all unite around, which was Jewish people, right? And he managed to, he was also a failed artist as well, but he managed to con the German people into believing basically that the Jews were to blame for all their problems. So he created a convenient scapegoat, and he was able to unite Germany around this perceived common enemy and get this welling up of German pride again. And he got Germans excited about being Germans again, right? And you give someone a common enemy, in this case it was the Jews, and you can do a lot of psychological damage to a population in that way. So they were vulnerable to this sort of this very nationalistic mentality because they were going to make Germany great again. Basically, was the idea behind it, and they had this common enemy that they could all blame, and rally behind. Amy Rogers, didn't Hitler used to paint castles? That may be true. I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure about that. So to go back to the idea of the situational attribution, maybe it wasn't that the German people were particularly evil by disposition. Maybe they were just particularly vulnerable to someone like Hitler coming along and taking advantage of that situation, right? And there's a lot of truth to that idea, right? I'm not saying that the German people were completely blameless. Don't misunderstand me, but they were particularly vulnerable to someone like Hitler, right? So social psychologists are interested in the situations that lead people to behave in the way that they have. They're interested in the situational attributions, whereas most psychologists have a tendency to make personal attributions, right? We talk about personality, we talk about mental illnesses, we talk about people's intelligence, we talk about things about the person themselves to explain their behavior. But social psychologists come along and say, well, in a lot of situations, you can actually explain people's behavior in terms of the social context or the situational context in which the person, the context that the person was in when they behaved in a certain way. So the fundamental attribution error is this tendency that we all have to overemphasize personal attributions when explaining other people's behavior. We have a tendency to not consider the situation that the person was in, right? So social psychologists say that when you want to understand a person's behavior, you don't just want to understand their personality and their intelligence and things about them personally, but you also want to understand the social situation and the context in which the behavior occurred if you fully want to understand the situation. And we want to avoid engaging in that fundamental attribution error, which is that tendency to disregard the situation when explaining other people's behaviors. So at this point, I'm going to go through and highlight some of the central concepts from chapter 12. I'm not going to touch on every single topic that's covered in the chapter, as is usually the case. I'm going to hit on some of the highlights that I consider to be personally most interesting from my experience teaching the course. But we're not going to be talking about the stuff around first impressions and thin slices of behavior and all of that stuff that the textbook goes into. We're going to start with looking at the concept of the self-fulfilling prophecy. So the self-fulfilling prophecy is something that we've talked a little bit already with concern to stereotype threat, but the self-fulfilling prophecy is this way that we have of behaving in a way that confirms our own or other people's expectations, right? So if we know that other people have certain expectations of us, being aware of those expectations often shapes our behavior in a way such that those expectations are fulfilled, right? Or if we, as they often say, as the saying goes, if you don't believe that you can do something, then you can't, right? So having a lack of belief in yourself causes you to try less hard, which then will uphold your belief in your lack of capability, right? So this is the idea of the self-fulfilling prophecy. One of the classic studies of the self-fulfilling prophecy illustrates what's known as the Pygmalion effect, which is named after a play by George Bernard Shaw, in which a poor woman, a ragamuffin, so to speak, as they would call in the parlance of the time, is adapted into society and dressed up to be a proper high society woman. And through proper training, this ragamuffin is she's trained and able to convince people that she's a member of the nobility, that she's a high class broad, so to speak, right? And that's the basic storyline behind the play Pygmalion by George Bernard Shaw. So this Pygmalion effect is basically the idea of the self-fulfilling prophecy. If you can convince someone to believe in themselves to a certain level, then you can bring that prophecy into fulfillment. So the classic study of self-fulfilling prophecies, or AKA the Pygmalion effect, was carried out in 1963 by a psychologist by the name of, I think it's Robert Rosenthal was his name, if I'm remembering his first name correctly. But Rosenthal was the psychologist, and he teamed up with this elementary school principal by the name of Lenore Jacobson. And this is a classic. It was done in 1963. If you Google the Rosenthal and Jacobson Bloomers study, there are plenty of videos on YouTube where you can watch actual footage from the actual study when it was done years ago. But basically what they did was Rosenthal, Jasmine Pravat, was the Pygmalion experiment influenced by My Fair Lady with Audrey Hepburn? Yeah, so My Fair Lady was actually based on the book Pygmalion by George Bernard Shaw. So yeah, that's a great connection, Jasmine. Yeah. So Pygmalion was the book that inspired My Fair Lady. I thought it was a Greek story about how the love goddess brought Pygmalion's statue named Glatia to life. That might be true, that there may be, I'm not familiar with that Greek story, but that may have been, that Greek story that you're mentioning may have been an influence on George Bernard Shaw when he wrote the play Pygmalion, or the book Pygmalion. But yeah, Pygmalion was the book that inspired the movie My Fair Lady with Audrey Hepburn. Yeah. So the Bloomers study, which was done in '63, which was carried out by Rosenthal and Jacobson. Rosenthal was the psychologist, I believe he was from Harvard University, and Lenore Jacobson, who was the elementary school principal that he teamed up with. What they did was they took this phony intelligence test that Rosenthal developed. It was just a made-up IQ test. It really didn't measure anything at all. It was just a bunch of random questions on it. It was not a standardized IQ test in any way. But Rosenthal and his research assistants gave this phony IQ test to a bunch of classrooms at this elementary school. And the principal was in on the experiment. And what the principal told the teachers in the classroom where this phony IQ test was administered was she told the teachers that the kids who get a higher score on this test, you're going to see their grades go up in the next year, right? So they're going to become what they called bloomers, right? Academic bloomers. So the kids who score high on this test, they're going to really bloom in the next year, and you're going to see their grades go up. What Jacobson and Rosenthal did not tell the teachers in the classroom where the phony test was given was that it was actually a phony IQ test. It was totally made up. It didn't measure anything at all. And the scores on the tests were just totally made up. They were just randomized. So they just picked a handful of students' names out of a hat, basically, to determine who the high scorers were, right? So they randomly selected who they were going to tell the teachers were the high scorers. So they got this list of randomly selected kids who it was just totally made up, but Rosenthal and the principal told the teachers in these classrooms, here are the names of the kids who scored really high on this test. Now keep in mind, the teachers in these classrooms believed that this was a real IQ test. They didn't know that it was a phony test, and they didn't know that the high scorers were just randomly drawn out of a hat. So they were given this list of high scorers on the test, and they were told that in the next year, you can expect that these particular kids in your classes, you can expect that their grades are going to go up dramatically. So what do you think actually happened after that? After these teachers were told, here are the kids whose grades are going to go up. Any hypotheses?
Their grades actually went up.
The grades actually went up. Yeah, that's exactly what happened. Their grades went up significantly. And it was a self-fulfilling prophecy. Why do you think that their grades went up? Anybody?
They held.
Yep. I think your microphone's off. There you go.
They held themselves to a higher standard subconsciously because they did well on the Bloomers test.
Right. Yeah. So that's the basic idea. The one key thing to note is, though, that the kids were never actually told that they were high scorers on the test. It was just their teachers who were told. And what actually, it was very much like a placebo effect, but it was the teachers that were told. So the students didn't even know that they had been identified as high scorers. But what actually happened was the teachers treated them differently, knowing that these kids were the higher scorers. They gave them more attention in class. They gave them more challenging work. They held them to a higher standard, right? So they expected more of the students. And expecting more of those students caused the teachers to actually treat them differently. And being treated differently by the teachers caused the students' grades to actually increase. So this is a classic study that illustrated that it's not just your belief in yourself that can cause you to improve, but other people's expectations of you can actually have a serious impact on your performance in life. I don't know why my phone's going off here. But other people's expectations of you can actually help create a self-fulfilling prophecy as well. This has profound implications for our education system when you think about it. When you think about the ways in which teacher expectations shape student behavior, this is really profound, because if you have teachers who aren't expecting very much of their students, then you're going to end up with a self-fulfilling prophecy where they're not going to get very much out of their students, right? So as a teacher, this tells me that I'm not doing you guys any favors by not expecting much from you guys, right? To hold you guys to a higher standard, to give you guys slightly harder exams, which I do. And I'm pretty easygoing on the essay grading, but my exams and my classes are relatively difficult. Now, normally they're not open book, but we're in kind of a special situation right now. But normally, you know, my exams are pretty difficult. And I do that because I don't feel like going off of the results of this line of research, it doesn't seem like I would be doing you guys any favors to not expect you guys to be able to handle it, if that makes sense. By expecting more out of you guys, I'm actually encouraging you guys to perform at a higher level. That's the way I look at it, at least. Any other thoughts or comments on the Bloomer study? All right, so let's move on. Antonio, placebo effect made them study more. Oh, I already read that. I'm not sure what that sound was. I don't think I have anybody waiting in the waiting room. Okay, so this idea of the self-fulfilling prophecy relates to the idea of prejudice and discrimination. And we've kind of already talked about this because I've talked about stereotype threat already to a fair degree in the chapter on intelligence testing, but this just kind of goes back to that, right? So when we have negative expectations of people, this can shape their behavior in a negative way. And when we have positive expectations of people, this can shape their behavior in a positive way, which, by the way, is called stereotype promise, which is the opposite of stereotype threat. But when we talk about prejudice and discrimination, these are ideas that have been studied and talked about a lot by social psychologists and by sociologists. But it's important that we distinguish the terms prejudice and discrimination. So prejudice has to do with attitudes. Prejudice is a belief, it's an attitude, a feeling, but discrimination is a behavior, right? So when you treat someone unfairly as a result of prejudice, then that's discriminatory behavior. So there's been a lot of work that's been done in the education system on looking at how to get students to behave in a less prejudicial manner and to have less prejudiced attitudes rather and behave in a less discriminatory manner. That's what I meant to say. And one of the most famous paradigms that you will hear about, it's been studied extensively, is the jigsaw classroom, which is a method that's often used in grade schools, elementary and middle schools. Maybe it's even been used on you in your educational past, and you might not even have known about it. But the idea is to set up group projects where you get students together into different groups, and you purposefully design the groups so that the groups are diverse in their demographic characteristics. So you want to make sure that you have a good balance of gender, a good balance of racial backgrounds, religious backgrounds, etc. And the idea is that if you get people of different backgrounds to work together towards a common goal, that this leads to decreased prejudice, decreased discriminatory behaviors. If you can work with people who you perceive as other than, people that you perceive as different than you, then this can result in an improvement in your attitudes towards members of that group. So just working together is just a relatively simple way to get people to reduce their prejudicial attitudes towards each other. And in the classroom, this is often achieved through the jigsaw method or the jigsaw classroom, where you have students work together in these mixed groups. And there's been extensive research that has validated this as a way to reduce prejudice among children in particular. But I would say it would work among adults as well. I mean, if you work with someone closely who you perceive as different than you, it's kind of difficult to work with someone and continue to have negative attitudes towards that person, at least for most people. through contact with the other, you have a better understanding of the other. And this also relates to the social contact hypothesis, which was studied by the social psychologist Gordon Allport, which I don't have in the slides, but it relates to this. Okay, so when we talk about prejudice, we're talking about attitudes, like I said. So more broadly speaking, an attitude is just an evaluation of something, whether it's an object, event, or a place, or other people. But an attitude ultimately is an evaluation about whatever it is we're talking about. We don't tend to have attitudes about things that we're neutral on, right? So an attitude is a positive or negative evaluation. And there's often an emotional component to an attitude as well, but there's an evaluative component, right? So either you have a positive attitude about something or a negative attitude. If you're neutral on something, then you would say you might say it's a neutral attitude or no attitude, right? Because attitudes tend to be evaluative. So when we talk about attitudes, social psychologists break them down broadly into simple attitudes and complex attitudes. So a simple attitude is an attitude that is consistent with your behavior, right? So let's think about a behavior like smoking, for example, which we talked about in a previous chapter on stress management. A behavior like smoking, we all know that it's bad for us, right? I don't think that there are very many people in the world today who honestly believe that smoking is good for them or that it's neutral for your body. I think pretty much everybody is aware of the fact that smoking is bad for you, right? But if you believe that smoking is bad for you and you believe that you shouldn't smoke and you continue to smoke and you do smoke, then that's a complex attitude. You have a behavior pattern that is not consistent with your attitude. Now, on the other hand, if you don't smoke and you believe that smoking is bad for you, then that's a simple attitude. Your behavior is consistent with your attitude. So when the attitude and behavior are consistent with each other, that's a simple attitude. When those things are inconsistent, that's what we refer to as a complex attitude. And in general, the stronger and more generally relevant an attitude is, the more likely it is to predict your behavior. So a lot of times when you talk to people that smoke, you'll hear them come up with these justifications, right? And maybe maybe you're one of these people, right? You'll hear people say things like, yeah, it's bad for me, but what isn't bad for you, right? Everything kills you, artificial sweetener kills you, eating meat's bad for you, alcohol's bad for you, you could die in a car accident, everything's bad for you, right? Smoking's no worse than any of these other things that everybody does that are bad for you. I might as well do it, right? So even though it's bad for you, you kind of rationalize it by saying, well, basically everything's bad for you, right? And what difference does it make? We're all going to die one day anyway, right? So that's a way that you'll often hear people rationalize their unhealthy behaviors with themselves. And this is a process that's known as cognitive dissonance, which I'll talk about more in a second. Before we get to cognitive dissonance, though, I want to also talk about the terms explicit attitude and implicit attitude. So with an explicit attitude, we're talking about an attitude that you're consciously aware of, right? So if I ask you, for example, how do you feel about classes being on Zoom, right? Most of us could probably have a position on that. I'm okay with it, actually. I like being in the classroom. I have a preference for being in the classroom, but this gets the job done and it's better than not being able to meet at all. And, it's okay, right? So my attitude towards Zoom is somewhat positive, you might say. I'm aware of that attitude. But some people might have an attitude about something that they're not even aware of. Donald has saved me gas money. Me too, buddy. Yeah, absolutely. I haven't had to put gas in my car since last week, actually, which is almost unheard of. So even though I drive a 4-cylinder. And in any case, sometimes we might have attitudes that we're not consciously aware of. And these are what are known as implicit attitudes. And this is an area somewhat of controversy in the field of psychological research, because not everybody is on the same page about implicit attitudes. But where you hear about implicit attitudes, sometimes referred to as implicit bias. So if you hear the term implicit bias, that's the same thing as implicit attitude. But sometimes you'll hear about implicit biases, particularly in conversations about race. So there's an argument, and there's been a line of research on this that seems to support the idea. I'm curious what you guys think. There's an argument that some people, for example, when it comes to race, may consciously report not being racist, right? For example, I don't think I'm a racist. I'd like to think that I'm not, at least, although there is a song on YouTube that you can look up called Everybody's a Little Bit Racist. Kind of funny song, actually, but look it up if you haven't watched it. It's kind of funny. But in any case, there's this, there's this sense in which most of us want to believe that we're not racist, right? You know, I treat all my students with respect, regardless of their race, nationality, religion. I think I'm a pretty fair-minded, open-minded guy, you know, even though I'm a straight white male. I think I'm pretty tolerant and respectful of other people. Explicitly, I would say I'm not a racist, right? And most people would probably say they're not a racist. Most people would probably believe that they're not racist, unless you're a skinhead or a member of the KKK or something like that. You know, you probably wouldn't hold racism to be something that you would be proud of, right? So most people would explicitly report not being racist. However, there's been a line of research that has suggested that even though people consciously may not be racist, there are explicit attitudes, they may have non-racist views explicitly, they still may have some implicit biases that may hide some prejudices that they might not even be aware that they have. So a common research method that's used to test this is take a bunch of white folks, for example, and give them a questionnaire which assesses how racist they are explicitly, right? So they'll take this racism questionnaire, and lo and behold, it turns out that according to their questionnaire results, they're not racist, right? They're pretty tolerant, open-minded white folks, right? Take the same people though, and put them in an MRI machine, looking at their brain, while you're showing them pictures of angry faces, and you show them a series of angry faces, like, you know, angry faces, and show them alternating photographs of white angry faces and black angry faces, and lo and behold, the fear part of the brain, which is the amygdala, will become more active in response to the black angry faces than it will to the white angry faces. So what this might suggest, so the argument goes, is that even though consciously, explicitly, they're not aware of having racist attitudes towards black people, say, for example, their brain is still more afraid of black people than it is of white people, according to the way their brain reacts when you show them pictures of white angry faces versus black angry faces. And this line of research is controversial, but it has shown that a lot of folks who consciously don't believe that they're racist will in fact have a greater fear reaction when they see a black face than a white face. What do you guys make of that line of research? Do you think there's anything to it, or thoughts on this? Donald says, laughing my ass off. Does this make sense to anybody? Is anybody skeptical of this finding? There are some psychologists who have questioned these findings. It's a controversial finding.
Yes, a little bit. I think, like, if you're seeing, okay, I don't want to sound racist because I'm not at all, but I feel like when people think that, like, Black people are more violent when they're angry than white people are, I don't think it's like a race thing. I think it's what they've been exposed to. And the whole, like, Black Lives Matter thing, right. Honestly, like, I'm not saying it didn't happen. It was happening. Like, a lot of white police officers were killing, like, innocent Black people. They weren't armed or anything. I don't think it was a racial thing. I mean, I know it kind of was sometimes, but I don't really think like that's what they're used to. They're used to coming, like, you know what I mean? They're taking necessary, I mean, not necessary precautions, but like that's what they're used to. I don't really see it all as like race. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah. And Devin says it can be dangerous because people can take this information and make generalities about white people and further dislike them. Yeah, it's controversial. And there is an alternative way of interpreting these results, actually. It's kind of similar to the problem of lie detector tests. Lie detector tests are not admissible in court because you can't make too many inferences out of people's physiological reactions, right? Some people's heart rates increase when they're lying, for example, and some don't. And it's kind of the same idea, right? Let's say you're taking a lie detector test and you're just really afraid of the test saying that you're lying. Well, this can create a self-fulfilling prophecy because the greater your heart rate when you're answering a question on a lie detector test, then the more deceptive the test says that you're being, right? So the more you're afraid of failing the test, the more likely you are to fail the test, basically, if that makes sense. That's a problem with lie detector tests. The more you're afraid of failing the test, the more likely you are to fail the test. So it's kind of a similar problem, right? If you're really afraid of this test identifying you as a racist, then it's possible that when you see a black face, you might react with more fear because you're afraid of getting that result, of being identified as having some racism, right? So maybe the fear of the test identifying you as a racist increases your fear response when you see the black face, which makes you appear to be more afraid of black people. So maybe there's a self-fulfilling prophecy thing going on here. And that's the alternative explanation of that result that you'll sometimes hear that makes that line of research controversial. So a lot of psychologists argue about what those findings actually mean. Jasmine says, I think it has a lot to do with social conditioning and the evolutionary fear of people who don't look like you. Not excusing it, but probably has something to do with it, right? So yeah, it would be interesting to do the flip of that, right? And it's probably been done, but I would be curious to see what it would look like if you took people of color and showed them and looked at their reactions to white angry faces versus the angry faces of people of color. And I wonder if, this has probably been done. I'm not familiar with the research. I wonder if people of color react with more fear to an angry white face than an angry face of someone who is of color, right? So that would be an interesting way to flip that around and see if the flip of that, is found, if you see what I'm trying to say there, right? So this idea of implicit attitudes or implicit bias is controversial, but you'll hear a lot of it talked about in the literature on racism and bias. So I mentioned a little while ago that people often experience a sense of discomfort when they are made aware of the fact that their attitudes are not consistent with their behavior, right? I talked about the example of smokers. So if you talk to a smoker about the fact that that smoking is bad for you, like I was talking about a few minutes ago, they'll usually come up with some sorts of rationalizations or justifications, like everything's bad for you, or you're gonna die one day, right? This is because people do not like it when it's pointed out that their attitudes are inconsistent with their behavior. When people become aware of the fact that their attitudes are inconsistent with their behavior, they experience a mental state that social psychologists have come to call cognitive dissonance. And this is basically that feeling of discomfort that you experience when someone points out or when you realize that your attitude and your behavior are not consistent with each other. Or maybe you have two contradictory attitudes that you're holding at the same time, right? So this state of mental conflict that you experience as a result of this. So the father of cognitive dissonance theory was a social psychologist by the name of Leon Festinger. And he did a lot of research on cognitive dissonance and on social comparisons. He's probably most known for cognitive dissonance theory. He also had social comparison theory. which we talked about when it came to self-esteem. I think I talked about that in Human Growth and Development, actually. But Fessinger's cognitive dissonance theory, which is pretty much a widely accepted idea these days in psychology, is that people experience this discomfort when they become aware of the fact that they have an internal contradiction, basically, right? So this state of internal contradiction is what they refer to as cognitive dissonance, and it causes a state of discomfort, either as an anxiety or a state of tension that is experienced as a result of this. And as the result of this, in order to alleviate this tension, folks want to try to justify the two things so that they line up. So the example I've already given is that a smoker will rationalize their smoking. Oh, well, you got to die one day anyway. Everybody does things that are unhealthy. This is the thing that I do, right? So that's their way of trying to get rid of their cognitive dissonance by engaging in that rationalization. But everybody does this to some degree. So it also arises when we have to choose between two options, right? So let's say that let's say that you're out shopping for a car, right? And you have two equal options in front of you. Let's say your budget is $10,000. You have $10,000 cash to spend, and you're going to pay cash for the car, and you've narrowed it down to two choices, right? You've got a used Honda Accord or a used Toyota Camry. And I drive a Camry, so I'm a little biased here, right? But you've narrowed it down to an Accord or a Camry. And both cars cost $10,000. Both cars have similar gas mileage. Both cars are in similar condition. And it's basically, they're totally equal, right? It's 6 in one, half a dozen in the other, as they say. And you're having trouble which car you're going to buy. Do I buy the Accord or do I buy the Camry? So let's say you flip a coin to decide which car you're going to buy, and surprise, you go with the Camry. Like I said, I drive a Camry, so I'm biased, right? But you flip a coin and you go with the Toyota Camry. And then later on, you're thinking about it, and you've managed to convince yourself that you liked the Camry more all along, right? You've convinced yourself that the choice that you went with was actually the superior choice. And you've kind of conveniently forgotten about the fact that you just flipped a coin, right? So we have a tendency after we've made a decision to convince ourselves that the choice that we made was indeed the superior choice. And you'll see people engage in this with relationship decisions, for example, right? The person I married must have been better than the person I didn't marry, right? Because this is the person I married, so they must have been the better choice, right? So this is what's known as post-decisional dissonance. We tend to convince ourselves after the fact, after we've made the decision, that the route that we went with was indeed the better way to go. The last slide that I want to talk about today with regard to cognitive dissonance, and then we'll end here today and we'll finish this chapter next time, is the classic study of cognitive dissonance that was conducted by Leon Fessinger and his associate Carl Smith. Fessinger and Carl Smith, all the way back in 1959, did this classic study of cognitive dissonance that's known as the insufficient justification of effort study. So the setup was this. They set up this experiment where they had somebody engage in an extremely boring task for a prolonged period of time. I want to say an hour, something like an hour. The researchers had you engaged in an extremely boring task. I don't know exactly what the task was, but think of the most boring thing that you can imagine and imagine doing it for an hour, right? So you're sitting in this room engaged in the most boring task that you can imagine for an hour. And then when your time is up, you are asked by the researcher to go out into the hallway and tell the next participant waiting in the hallway how much fun you had during the experiment, how interesting it was. In other words, you're being asked to lie to the next participant. You're being asked to tell them how interesting and fun what they're about to do is. When you know for a fact that it's probably going to be the most boring thing that they've ever done in their life. Now, here's the catch. In one situation, they paid the participant $20 to lie to the next participant. In the other condition, they paid the participant only $1 to lie to the next participant. So you're either being paid $1 to lie to the next participant, or you're being paid $20 to lie to the next participant. Keep in mind, back in 1959, $20 was a hell of a lot of money. That's probably like $100 today or more, right? I don't know the exact figure, but if you adjust for inflation, it's got to be like $100 today or something like that. Somebody can Google it and look it up if you want to. But $20 back in 1959 was a lot of money, right? $1 was probably more like $10 today, right? Still a decent amount of money, but not something that you can take, a month off of work as a result of, right? But $20, quite a lot of money back in 1959. So you're being paid $20 to lie to the next participant, or you're being paid $1 to lie to the next participant. So who do you think, well, there was one last thing that I want to add, not to confuse you guys. So about a month later, after the study was over, there was a follow-up. There's someone in our front yard. Hey, Bruce is here. Bruce is here. Yeah, Bruce and Kayla are here. Sorry, guys. In any case, we have unexpected guests. They are not observing social distancing. Yeah, seriously. They are not social distancing right now. Michelle looked it up. It would be like $178 today, $20, right? So imagine getting paid almost $200 to lie to somebody, right? That's basically what was going on in this situation. So they followed up with the research participants like a month later, or sometime later. It was maybe a week or a month. I don't remember the exact amount of time, but the lie was that you were asked to tell the next participant how much fun they had had, to tell the next participant how much fun the experiment was going to be. It was a really boring experiment, and you were asked to lie to them. You were asked to lie to them about how much fun the experiment was, right? Amy Rogers says, easy, I'd do it, right? Me too. So you get asked to lie, and you get paid either $20 or $1. $20, a lot of money back then, almost $200 today. So they followed up with the research participants a couple of weeks or so later after the experiment, and they asked the participants how much fun they had had in the experiment. How interesting was the experiment? So who do you think said the experiment was more interesting and fun? The folks who were paid $20 to lie, or the folks who were paid $1 to lie? Who do you think said it was more fun? 20. Yeah, that's what you would expect. You would expect the folks who you would expect the folks who got paid more, the really large sum, you would expect them to report having had a better time in the experiment, and that the experiment was more interesting to them. What they actually found was the exact opposite. They found that the folks who were paid only $1 to lie to the next participant reported having a lot more fun during the experiment than the folks who were paid 20. And the reason for this was cognitive dissonance. When you think about it, no worries, Haley. When you think about it, the folks who were only paid $1 to lie to the next participant, they didn't want to think of themselves as liars. They didn't want to think of themselves as the sort of people who would tell a bold-faced lie to another human being just for $1, right? So they needed to justify their lie because the dollar was insufficient justification of effort, right? So the dollar wasn't enough to justify their behavior. So instead, they actually bullshitted themselves into actually believing that they had had a good time during this experiment because they didn't want to think of themselves as the type of folks who would lie for $1. Now, on the other hand, the folks who were paid $20 to lie, which is almost like $200 today, they didn't feel too bad about lying. They didn't feel like they needed to justify it because they were basically given an offer that they couldn't refuse, so to speak. In terms of The Godfather, right? They were given an offer they couldn't refuse. Like a couple of you guys said, if someone offered you almost $200 to lie to somebody, you'd probably do it, right? And you probably wouldn't feel too bad about it because it's $200, right? And you wouldn't think of yourself as a liar for doing so because who could resist that, right? It's almost an irresistible offer. So they didn't feel the need to lie to themselves and tell themselves that they had actually had a good time during the experiment. They knew that they lied to the other participant, but they had the $200 to justify doing it, right? If that makes sense. And you see this among folks who join fraternities, for example. Oftentimes there's a hazing ritual involved in joining fraternities. And what they actually have found in the social psychology research is that people are more loyal to an organization if they go through a hazing ritual to have to join it. And cognitive dissonance explains this, right? Because it's the idea that I wouldn't have gone through this humiliation to join this organization if this organization wasn't worth being a member of, right? I'm not the type of person that would allow myself to be humiliated to join an organization that is not worth being a member of. I went through this humiliation to join this organization, therefore this organization must be all that, right? So in this way, going through a hazing actually causes people to be more enthusiastic and loyal about the organization that they join after they've gone through the hazing ritual, if that makes sense. Can anybody think of any other examples of this? We're about out of time. Hunter? No? Okay. So that's going to be it for today. And next time we will continue chapter 12 with the topic of persuasion. And the goal will be to get through the rest of chapter 12 on Thursday. And I hope this has been an interesting lecture for you guys. I really enjoy social psych. It's a fascinating topic to me. If you have not signed in, please go ahead and do so. For those of you who didn't do it at the beginning of class. And for those of you who have any questions or would like to meet with me privately via Zoom, you're always welcome to email me and we can set up an appointment time where we can have a private Zoom meeting if you need to chat about anything. And as always, I'm available just by email if you just have a question that can be resolved via email. So I hope that everybody is staying safe and healthy. And I will see you guys on Thursday. I'm going to sign out here in a second. I will stay signed in for another few seconds to give anybody who hasn't signed in a chance to do so. And I will see you guys on Thursday. Later. Jordan, I'm looking at your question. I'm not sure I'm following the question. Could you maybe email me with the opposite of post-decisional dissonance, like buyer's remorse. I think buyer's remorse might be the term for that. Yeah, that's the term that I would think of. That would be the opposite of post-decisional dissonance. Yeah, that does happen sometimes. Sometimes you're just not able to convince yourself that you made the better choice. I would call that buyer's remorse. Yeah. Yep. All right, I'll see you guys on Thursday. I'm going to sign out.